They were the enemy, captured soldiers expecting chains and slow starvation in American prison camps. Instead, they were given something far more terrifying than punishment: a second chance, a dignified job, and the khaki uniform of the very army that defeated them. The silence of the desert was sometimes worse than the noise of battle. All that remained was the omnipresent scent of dust, the constant low hum of the cicadas, and the unshakable weight of barbed wire that defined their world. Massimo Rossi, age 23, counted his breath every morning, a small exercise in reclaiming control that the relentless heat often stole. Captured in Tunisia, he was deposited into a sprawling enclosure deep within the American Southwest. This was not the America he had been taught to fear, a cage of steel and fire, but something far stranger, a land of empty, terrifying abundance. The sun rose like a punishing white fist, promising heat that baked the despair right out of a man and left them constantly thirsty. Massimo, a former torpedo mechanic, possessed the sharp, cynical eye of men who trusted machines more than men. He had served Mussolini out of a simple need for work, not passion. Now, every rumor from German prisoners spoke of the same fate. They were held for punishment. They would be forced into labor, beaten, or simply forgotten under this relentless sun. These stories were printed in their minds. He missed the smell of salt water and oil. Here, the air tasted only of dry earth and coal smoke. The food was meager, and the days were endless repetitions of roll call and scrubbing floors. The American guards, in their crisp khaki, moved with an unsettling lack of malice. They were cold, professional, and efficient. This calm indifference was, to Massimo, more frightening than open rage. It suggested they didn't even consider the prisoners worthy of their anger. They were below the level of hate. The cynicism was widespread. During recreation, the men argued over the war's progress. They all agreed on one thing: America had captured them not because it was honorable, but because it was wealthy and vengeful. They expected the brutal cruelty of totalitarian states. They expected to have their dignity crushed until nothing was left. Massimo had a small, tattered photograph of his fiancée, Luisa. Looking at her face was the only thing that gave his survival effort meaning. He needed to return to her, but the thought of perishing of neglect in this dusty cage filled him with cold dread. The greatest misery was the paralyzing predictability of their fate, the endless, identical days stretching before them. But the routine, designed to break them down, would soon be violently interrupted. That morning, the usual bugle call was replaced by an unfamiliar, urgent shouting near the main administrative block, a sound of chaos that defied the usual meticulous order of the camp. Something in the desert was changing, and it was about to reach the wire. The urgent shouting was not anger, but command, sharp and unfamiliar. It cut through the monotony, forcing all 4,000 prisoners to assemble on the dusty parade ground beneath the blistering mid-morning sun, their anxiety palpable. Massimo felt a knot of cold anxiety tighten in his stomach. This was the moment, the repayment the Reich had warned them about. He watched as a long black sedan pulled up, followed by a platoon of unfamiliar American soldiers. A tall, impeccably dressed colonel stepped out. He spoke clearly through a translator. His first words were historical. Italy had switched sides. The fascist regime had fallen, and Italy had declared its cooperation with the Allies, a devastating strategic reversal. The news landed like a stone. Some cheered, others muttered curses, but most were too stunned to process the geopolitical earthquake. Then came the next, even more bewildering declaration. As a co-belligerent nation, the colonel announced, the Italian prisoners here are now eligible to volunteer for special, non-combat work assignments for the United States Army. These units, the ISUs, would be transferred out of the barbed wire, paid small wages, 80 cents a day, fed better rations, and housed in better conditions. They would provide essential labor, freeing American soldiers for combat in the European theater. Massimo listened, his mind working fast. Volunteer for the enemy? This wasn't punishment, it was a bizarre transaction. Whispers erupted. Were they being offered a genuine chance or a trick to identify the weakest among them? One fascist named Emilio spat into the dust. Traitors! They want us to serve the people destroying our cities. Massimo's skepticism was more complex. He didn't trust the Americans, but he trusted starvation less. The thought of real food was overwhelming. The colonel silenced the men. "This is not mandatory," he reiterated. "You may remain here as standard prisoners, but those who volunteer will work for the war effort, for a better life here, and eventually for the rebuilding of your homeland." He gave them 24 hours to decide. As the colonel drove away, the camp dissolved into a frenzy. It was a choice between the certainty of misery and the possibility of betrayal. Massimo made a cynical, desperate calculation: better food, better housing, and a path out of the barbed wire. He prioritized survival above all else. He looked once more at the photograph of Luisa. Survival was the only loyalty that mattered now. When the list for volunteers was circulated, Massimo Rossi put his name down, committing to the impossible alliance. He had chosen to trust the enemy's logic over his own deep-seated fears. The rising sun the next day found him standing with 50 skeptical volunteers, ready to leave the only security they had known. Their first destination was a storage depot outside the wire, where they were promised their new work clothes. Massimo had signed up for better food, but he had no idea he was about to put on a different identity altogether. Stepping through the gate felt like walking out of the world and into a strange, unsettling performance. Massimo felt the immediate shift. The dust was the same, but the oppressive silence of the wire was gone, replaced by the mundane sounds of trucks and metal, a symphony of industry. 50 volunteers, looking utterly lost in their worn Italian uniforms, were marched to a sprawling depot complex that smelled of gasoline and new canvas. Piled high in crates and on tables was the proof of the American promise. They were led into a warehouse by supply officers. "You will exchange your clothes for this," the officer stated. Massimo was handed fresh, stiff garments, trousers, thick socks, an olive khaki fatigue shirt, and a jacket. Holding the shirt was a shock. It was heavy, woven from powerful cotton, superior in quality to his thin Italian uniform. But the real jolt came from the cut. These were United States Army fatigues, the very fabric worn by the men who had captured him. A cold wave of shame washed over him. Putting on the enemy's uniform felt like an act of ultimate betrayal, a total psychological surrender. One lieutenant, Emilio, raised a trembling hand. "But this is the uniform of the enemy," he whispered. The American officer simply pointed. Stitched onto the back pocket and the front of the shirts were large, stenciled letters. PW. Below that, a black patch labeled Italy. The garment was officially marked as property of the defeated. Massimo walked behind a partition and slowly stripped off his old clothes, feeling naked. He then dressed in the crisp, alien American fabric. The shirt was too broad, the trousers stiff, but the fit was surprisingly good. When he stepped out, he was no longer an Italian prisoner in rags. He was a man in American khaki, visibly transformed by the confidence of the material. His old identity was now in a pile. The 50 men stared. They looked from a distance like American laborers. This was the genius of the program. They were both visible and invisible, protected by the enemy's color, but defined by the black stencil of captivity. This simple act of changing clothes had done more to erase the propaganda of fascism than any lecture. They had been promised a cage of steel, but were given the dignity of a uniform, a conditional yet functional shield. Massimo touched the fabric on his shoulder, feeling the weight of the cloth and the weight of the decision. He was leaving behind the uniform of his past, stepping into the uncertain, pragmatic future. He was still a prisoner, but he no longer looked like one. This set of khakis was their ticket out of the dust and into the strange, humming machinery of the American war effort. The train ride west was an education in American scale. For 2 days, the ISU traveled across a busy continent, its vastness almost impossible to grasp. He pressed his face against the gritty window, hypnotized by the blur. They traveled past endless grain fields, cities built of glass and sheer will, and sprawling factories that produced an avalanche of materials 24 hours a day. The propaganda had promised disorganized criminals. Instead, Massimo saw meticulous organization and terrifying, limitless wealth. When the train stopped, they had reached the California desert near Depot 5, a sprawling city of supply. The place was enormous, a logistical city carved out of the rock. It was a maintenance hub where the massive war machine paused to be cleaned, repaired, and fed. Acres of heavy vehicles sat awaiting work. The noise was constant, the clatter of machinery, the roar of engines, and the shouting of thousands of men all keeping supply lines open. It was an overwhelming sight. Massimo and his men were marched to repair hangars. Sergeant Miller, with a face like worn leather, surveyed the group. Miller pointed to a row of broken-down trucks. "You," he said to Massimo. "You're a mechanic. Get that engine running. Now." For Massimo, the order was a shock of normalcy. After months of purposeless waiting, he was asked to use his actual skill. He walked toward the truck, running his fingers over the engine block. He understood the engine's problem immediately, a faulty carburetor gasket. For the first time since his capture, Massimo felt the familiar satisfaction of analyzing a problem and knowing he could solve it. The American approach was baffling. They were given good tools, clean, well-maintained, and plentiful. They were supervised but not harassed. Miller's expectation was simple: competence. "We don't care about your politics," Miller said. "We care about the engine. Fix the engine, you eat well." It was an equation based purely on utility, devoid of ideological fury. The men worked side by side with American personnel. Massimo, covered in oil and grease, spent his day immersed in American engineering. He was still a prisoner, but he was also a valued component of a vast logistical machine. It was a bizarre kind of dignity, a silent acknowledgement that his hands were useful even if his politics were defeated. He finished the repair just as the sun set. The engine roared to life. Miller simply nodded, offering no compliment, only a wordless recognition. But in that small, pragmatic nod, Massimo understood something profound. He had entered a nation that measured a man's worth not by his flag, but by the smooth running of a cylinder. The question now was whether this strange transactional respect could ever evolve into true trust. In the motor pool, Massimo found his world reduced to bolts and bearings, a technical language he understood. The true conflict, however, was internal, fought among the men of his unit, a psychological war of loyalty. The ISU was fractured. A small faction led by Carlo saw the collaboration as a deep moral failing. Carlo labeled the volunteers as the khaki traitors. Massimo ignored him, focused on the engine block of his truck. For him, political ideology was a distraction from the tangible reality of survival. His supervisor was Sergeant Miller. Miller's authority was rooted in his understanding of the machine. One afternoon, Massimo struggled with a complex transmission alignment, needing a custom wrench the depot lacked. Frustrated, he tried improvising, a risky solution for any mechanic. Miller, watching, walked over. He understood the sight of a skilled mechanic attempting a desperate solution. Without preamble, Miller pulled the exact offset wrench Massimo needed from his personal toolbox. He handed it over. Massimo looked up, but Miller had already turned away. In that brief wordless exchange, Massimo understood the foundation of the American system. Respect was earned by competence, and competence transcended enemy lines. Skill was the new universal currency. The transmission was repaired smoothly. When Carlo approached, demanding why he was smiling like a satisfied slave, Massimo simply pointed to the running truck. "The machine does not ask your politics," he replied. "It only asks your skill. And this America, it only pays for the results." The division grew sharper. For men like Carlo, the ISU experience was betrayal. For Massimo, it was a profound re-education. He was treated better by the enemy than by his own collapsing government. The daily meal, the clean uniform, the sharp tools, these were the pragmatic currency of efficiency. The American system simply required him to work, providing him with basic, undeniable dignity. Massimo realized the uniform stamped PW was changing its meaning. It was no longer just the cloth of a prisoner. It was the cloth of a professional. This quiet realization was the first step toward breaking down the walls of ideological certainty that had defined his life. He packed the borrowed wrench back into Miller's box. He knew this strange, pragmatic acceptance was a powerful weapon. The system that valued his hands was slowly starting to capture his mind, preparing him for a deeper cultural shock beyond the perimeter. The great daily battle was fought in the mess hall. It was a confrontation with the humiliating reality of American abundance, a feast for men who expected scraps. For Massimo and the ISU members, the sheer volume and quality of the food was a moral challenge. In Italy, they knew rationing and scarcity. Here, the tables groaned under roast beef, fresh milk, and strong coffee. They were fed better than the average American civilian. Every prisoner received the 3,200-calorie ration, a daily affirmation of legal obligation that felt suspiciously like kindness. One evening, Massimo sat staring at a large piece of apple pie. Carlo, the cynic, pushed his plate away. "It is a bribe," Carlo hissed. "They feed us so we forget what we are." But Massimo ate the pie slowly, savoring the taste of a nation that could afford to feed its enemies so well, a luxury unknown in their homeland. This dignified provisioning was a form of psychological warfare. The supply officers acted like men fulfilling a precise, logistical task. This cold, almost impersonal adherence to decency was bewildering. They were given what they were owed as a right, guaranteed by the Geneva Conventions. It was the rule of law, not sentimentality. This constant proof of moral confidence eroded the ideological walls of fascism. They had been told the Americans lacked integrity. Yet here was materialism in service of a moral code. The dignity extended beyond food. They had time for observance and a library. One morning, Massimo found a new chrome-plated cigarette lighter on his workbench, replacing the faulty one he tried to fix. It was a silent, unsanctioned gift, an acknowledgement of his hard work from Sergeant Miller. That tiny piece of chrome felt heavier than any ideology. It was given by a man to another man who had proven his worth. Massimo looked around, seeing the khaki uniforms, the endless supply. This was not the cage of punishment he expected. This was a place where skill was rewarded and human dignity was upheld, a profound counter-narrative. The realization settled over him. They were not being humiliated. They were being respected. It was the most shocking, destabilizing discovery of his captivity. It forced him to question everything he believed about the war. The kindness shown to Massimo by Sergeant Miller was unexpected and non-military. Have you ever experienced a powerful human connection with someone you expected to be an adversary? Tell us your story in the comments below. The world inside Depot 5 was governed by rules and precision, but the world beyond was a shimmering, impossible dream. The ISU members had yet to confront the turbulent human reality of wartime America, where civilians held strong opinions. The opportunity arrived disguised as a supply run. Massimo and 10 others were selected to accompany Sergeant Miller into the nearest town. They piled into a canvas-covered truck, their uniforms making them look like a platoon of American workers. The trip was silent and tense. As the truck approached the town, Massimo gazed out at a world untouched by conflict. The town was vibrant, untouched. There were no bomb craters, only ordinary people moving with casual ease. Brightly colored posters advertised movies and Coca-Cola. Women drove cars. The atmosphere was one of limitless energy and security, a dizzying glimpse of the American dream in full operation. As the truck stopped, the men climbed out. A young boy, perhaps 7, stopped, staring at Massimo's uniform. The boy lifted his hand in a tentative wave and whispered, "Thank you for fighting." Massimo froze. For one fleeting second, he was seen not as an enemy, but as a useful contributor. The moment was violently shattered by an older man, a veteran missing an arm. He spotted the PW stamp in the subtle, dark-haired faces. His eyes narrowed and flared into uncontrolled fury. He began shouting, his words sharp and easily understood even without translation. He demanded to know why Axis trash were walking freely. His voice drew a crowd, and the danger was immediate. The tension became electric. Carlo tightened his fist. But before any Italian could react, Sergeant Miller stepped forward. Miller did not argue. He simply placed his large frame between the veteran and the prisoners. "You stand down, soldier," Miller ordered, his voice low and firm. "These men are under the protection of the Geneva Conventions. They are doing essential labor for the U.S. Army. They will be treated with professional respect." The veteran sputtered protests, but Miller's authority was absolute. The veteran was escorted away, defeated by the cold, unflinching application of military law. Massimo watched, utterly stunned. He had expected the officer to join the veteran. Instead, Miller had defended them, the enemy, because they were owed dignity by the very rules of the conflict. The return trip was silent, but the silent meaning of the uniform had changed again. It wasn't just a mark of labor, it was a shield of law. America's strength was not just in its factories, but in its unbending adherence to principle, even when facing popular rage. The incident in town forced Massimo to confront a deep question. Why? Why did the American machine defend him, the enemy, against one of its own wounded veterans? He needed a definitive answer. He found his answer not in a sermon, but in the pragmatic language of logistics, delivered one quiet evening by Sergeant Miller. The air was cooling, leaving behind the smell of oil. Massimo was inspecting a jeep when Miller approached. Massimo pointed at the PW stamp on his shirt, a silent request for understanding. Miller understood immediately. He sat down on a crate, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He explained the cold, efficient truth of the ISU program. "It's about the war, and the war needs trucks," Miller admitted, his voice low and gravelly. The U.S. was facing a crippling manpower shortage. Millions of men were overseas, leaving critical jobs empty. The Army wasn't acting out of sentimentality. It was acting out of sheer necessity. The 400,000 Axis prisoners were a pool of skilled labor. Keeping them busy and well-maintained was simply good business. An efficient mechanic caused fewer problems, and the Army valued efficiency above all. "We follow the rules," Miller continued, "because the rules work." The Geneva Convention was a strategic tool. By showing discipline and respect, the Americans ensured their own captured soldiers were treated similarly, and they created a productive workforce. Massimo listened, mesmerized. This was a system built on practical accountability, not vengeance. The dignity, the food, the uniform. It was all part of a colossal logistical calculation. The American moral confidence he had witnessed was simply the adherence to a principle that kept the entire war machine running smoothly. It was logic dressed as mercy. This realization was paradoxically liberating. Massimo had expected hate, but he had only encountered pragmatism. He wasn't being asked to betray his past. He was being hired for his skill. His worth was measured by the smooth running of the cylinder heads. The uniform was a badge of economic utility and a shield of legal protection. The propaganda of hate crumbled under the simple, crushing weight of American organization. He saw the enemy not as a monster, but as a vast, disciplined corporation. Massimo stood up. The U.S. had won not just because it had more factories, but because it had a system that could afford dignity, even for its prisoners. It was a strength his homeland had never possessed. He now worked with a new focus, understanding that his labor was a necessary contribution to the order of the world. The khaki uniform was now a symbol of his earned place in the machine. The internal conflict was over. The news arrived with the stutter of a radio transmission. One quiet morning in May, 1945, Sergeant Miller walked into the motor pool and turned off every machine, ending the war with a simple gesture. The sudden silence was deafening. Miller gathered the men, his face relieved. "It's over," he said. "The war in Europe is done." There were no cheers, only a profound, stunned silence. For the next week, the men continued work, maintaining the machinery now used for demobilization. The atmosphere was saturated with a strange melancholy. Then came the final, inescapable order. Repatriation processing meant the uniforms had to come off. The following afternoon, they were led back to the supply hangar. The khaki fatigues, once symbols of the enemy's efficiency, were treated with impersonal logic. "Strip down," the officer commanded. Massimo stood before a stack of used Italian-issued clothes, the remnants of his former life, and slowly unbuttoned his U.S. Army shirt. As the khaki slid from his shoulders, he felt sudden exposure and loss. The American uniform, despite the PW, had paradoxically become a shield of dignity. He looked at the fabric, slightly frayed and stained with grease. It defined his utility, his value as a man. He knew he would miss the feel of it. He folded the khaki neatly, placing it on the pile. The old Italian uniform felt cheap and sterile on his skin. He watched the uniforms tossed into bins, destined to be forgotten. The American army had no room for sentimental endings. Massimo found a moment for remembrance. He slipped his hand into the pocket of the discarded trousers. He retrieved the chrome cigarette lighter and a small polished copper button from the cuff. He concealed both deep inside his worn boot, a secret testament to the strange, productive year. He was prepared for the journey home, dressed as a defeated Italian. But he knew the man beneath the fabric had fundamentally changed. The war had ended, and the khaki uniform was gone. But the discipline and the realization of pragmatic moral strength remained. These were scars that would not fade. He was returning not just with a mechanic's skill, but with a powerful secret idea concealed in his boot. The idea that kindness and order were the strongest currencies in the world. He was ready to leave America, yet he was carrying a fundamental part of its character with him. The end of the war brought confusion and mixed emotions for everyone involved. If this story of unexpected dignity and the complex meaning of a uniform resonated with you, please take a moment to share it with someone who appreciates the surprising human truths found in history. The crossing was long and slow, a final gray passage back to a continent breathing ash and despair. When Massimo finally disembarked in Naples, the city was a ruin, the docks completely unrecognizable. The train journey north was a harrowing visual lesson in defeat and destruction. Houses were shattered, bridges were down. The contrast with the depot's efficiency was profound. When he finally found Luisa, she was exhausted, but alive. The challenge of rebuilding was immense, requiring effort beyond physical strength. The greatest hurdle was credibility. When Massimo tried to explain his time, the good food, the dignity, the uniform, his family listened with suspicion. "They would beat you for looking sideways. You have been gone too long," his uncle accused. They couldn't reconcile the image of a cruel America with the one Massimo carried, a nation of meticulous organization and pragmatic decency. But Massimo carried the proof in his discipline. He had brought home the skills and mindset learned from Miller. He immediately began working in a shattered local garage using efficient American methods. His focus on organization and consistent quality quickly set him apart from the chaos. His English, learned through manuals, got him noticed by the Allied occupation forces. They needed mechanics. When officers heard him discuss carburetor alignment with precision, he was employed, using his khaki-earned skill to repair the city's infrastructure. He was suddenly indispensable. His greatest victory was psychological. At the garage, he encountered men filled with bitterness. Massimo would calmly tell them about Depot 5 not as a moral tale, but as a lesson in practical power. "They are strong," he would say, "not because they are cruel, but because they are orderly. They do not waste time on hate." He explained that the dignity he received was a sign of the American system's confidence. A truly strong nation does not need to destroy the self-respect of the defeated. Slowly, his success chipped away at the resentment. Massimo, the former prisoner, became an unlikely ambassador of peace. Years later, as Italy rebuilt, Massimo's early realization became a shared truth. He often thought of Miller. The uniform was temporary, but the lesson was permanent. The greatest freedom was the freedom from vengeance. Massimo spent his life contributing to the new Italy, proving that the most powerful seeds of peace are sown not by diplomats, but by a simple mechanic under the glare of a desert sun, a man who wore the enemy's uniform. What Massimo discovered was that the greatest kindness could be a nation's most powerful strategic weapon. If you were shocked by the truth hiding behind this remarkable piece of history, make sure you subscribe and like this video for more unbelievable stories from the past.